Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where we explore the mysteries that keep us awake at night. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, I want to thank the countless comments that suggested this incredible story. If you have ideas for future videos, please leave them in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy these mysterious narratives that blur the line between fiction and reality. What if everything you've been taught about the planet is a lie, and one person finally uncovers the truth? Marcus Reed had always been the type of person who questioned everything. While his classmates accepted textbook diagrams of Earth's curvature without question, Marcus found himself staring at the horizon during family beach trips, wondering why he couldn't see the curve everyone insisted was there. While others trusted satellite images from NASA, Marcus wondered who controlled those cameras, and why certain areas always seemed conveniently obscured by clouds. By his 30s, Marcus had built a modest career as a freelance researcher, specialising in declassified government documents and historical anomalies. His small apartment in Denver was cluttered with filing cabinets, corkboards covered in red string connecting various conspiracy theories, and multiple computer monitors displaying satellite feeds, weather patterns, and archived military documents. Friends called him obsessive. Marcus preferred the term thorough. What Marcus didn't know was that his methodical nature and refusal to accept conventional wisdom would soon lead him on the most dangerous journey of his life, one that would challenge everything humanity believed about the very ground beneath their feet. This is the story of how one man's curiosity became a threat so significant that powerful forces would stop at nothing to silence him. The truth, as Marcus would discover, wasn't just stranger than fiction. It was sharper than anyone could imagine. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, buried among the usual spam and newsletter subscriptions that filled Marcus's inbox. The subject line read, "Classified Antarctic Survey, Eyes Only, 1962. The sender's address was a random string of letters and numbers from a temporary email service. Marcus almost deleted it. He received dozens of hoax documents every week from attention seekers and pranksters who knew about his research into government cover-ups. But something about this particular message felt different. The attachment was a high-resolution scan of what appeared to be an authentic military document, complete with official letterhead, classification stamps, and the kind of bureaucratic language that was difficult to fake convincingly. The document detailed a joint military operation called Project Horizon's End, conducted in 1962 by American and Soviet forces, an unprecedented collaboration during the height of the Cold War. The mission's stated objective was to conduct comprehensive geological surveys of the Antarctic perimeter zones, with particular attention to navigational anomalies and cartographic inconsistencies. What caught Marcus's attention wasn't the official language, but what was hidden between the lines. The document referenced strict protocols for personnel experiencing disorientation beyond the 85th parallel south, and mandatory psychological evaluation following exposure to geographical impossibilities. Most intriguingly, there were multiple references to a Zone 7 that required special clearance due to the sensitive nature of cosmological implications. Marcus spent the rest of that day attempting to verify the document's authenticity. The letterhead matched archived examples he found in legitimate military databases. The formatting, typography, and even the quality of paper visible in the scan all suggested this was genuine. But when he tried to cross-reference Project Horizon's End with other declassified operations from the same period, he found nothing. It was as if the entire mission had been scrubbed from official records. That evening, Marcus pulled up Google Earth and began examining satellite images of Antarctica. He focused his attention on areas beyond the 85th parallel south, looking for anything that might correspond to the mysterious Zone 7 mentioned in the document. What he found made his hand shake as he gripped his coffee mug. In a region of Antarctica that should have been clearly visible, there was a massive area obscured by what the satellite data labelled as persistent cloud cover. The clouds formed an almost perfect rectangle stretching for hundreds of miles. Marcus checked historical satellite data going back 15 years. The cloud cover was always there, in exactly the same position, with exactly the same shape. Clouds don't behave that way. Weather patterns shift constantly, but this anomaly remained fixed like a digital censorship bar placed over something Google didn't want people to see. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Throughout his years of research, he had investigated claims about flat Earth theory, typically dismissing them as pseudoscience promoted by attention seekers and conspiracy theorists. But the evidence in front of him suggested something far more disturbing than simple misinformation. What if the flat Earth theorists were wrong about the details but right about the cover-up? What if the truth about Earth's shape wasn't that it was flat, but that its actual configuration was so different from what people believed that revealing it would cause global panic? Marcus opened a new browser tab and began researching everything he could find about Antarctica's restricted zones, military operations in polar regions, and historical attempts to map the continent's true borders. The deeper he dug, the more questions emerged. Why were civilian flights forbidden from crossing Antarctic airspace? Why did every Antarctic expedition require extensive government approval and military escort? And why, despite decades of satellite technology, were large portions of the continent still marked as unmapped on official charts? By 3 a.m, Marcus had filled 17 pages with notes, printed dozens of satellite images, and created a timeline of suspicious Antarctic activities dating back to the 1940s. As he finally prepared for bed, one thought echoed in his mind. If someone had gone to the trouble of sending him that classified document, they wanted him to find something. The question was whether they were trying to help him uncover the truth or lure him into a trap. The next morning brought another email from the same anonymous address. This time there was no document attached, just a single line of text. The maps are wrong. Look for yourself. Marcus spent the following weeks attempting to contact anyone who might have first-hand knowledge of Antarctic anomalies. Through online forums and research networks, he managed to connect with a retired Navy pilot named James Patterson, who had flown supply missions to research stations in the 1980s. They met at a coffee shop in Colorado Springs, and Marcus was immediately struck by Patterson's nervous demeanour. The former pilot kept glancing around the cafe as if expecting to be overheard, and his hands trembled slightly as he stirred his coffee. "I shouldn't be talking to you about this," Patterson said quietly. "I signed NDAs that don't expire until I'm dead. But I'm 73 years old, and I've been carrying this for 40 years. Patterson explained that during his Antarctic missions, he had been required to follow extremely specific flight paths. Deviation from approved routes, even by a few miles, resulted in immediate radio contact from ground control ordering immediate course correction. When Patterson asked his commanding officer about the restrictions, he was told it was to avoid dangerous weather patterns and preserve fuel efficiency. But here's the thing," Patterson continued, lowering his voice further. "On my final mission in 1987, we had an equipment malfunction that forced us off the approved route. I was flying at 15,000 feet, clear visibility, perfect weather. As we approached what my charts showed as the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf, I saw something that shouldn't have existed." Marcus leaned forward. "What did you see?" "A wall," Patterson whispered. "Not a regular ice formation or glacier. A vertical wall of ice extending as far as I could see in both directions. It had to be at least 200 feet high, maybe more. And here's the part that still gives me nightmares. It was perfectly straight. Nature doesn't create straight lines like that, especially not across hundreds of miles." Patterson explained that before he could investigate further, his radio crackled with urgent commands to return to base immediately. When he landed, he was debriefed by officers he had never seen before. They confiscated all of his navigation logs, film, and personal notes from the flight. The official incident report claimed he had experienced altitude sickness and hallucinations due to equipment failure. "They transferred me to desk duty the next week," Patterson said. "Never flew Antarctic missions again, but I know what I saw, and I know they didn't want me to see it." After the meeting with Patterson, Marcus decided to conduct his own experiments. If Earth's curvature was different from what people believed, he should be able to detect inconsistencies using simple physics and optical equipment. Marcus drove to several large lakes in Colorado and Wyoming, bringing with him a high-powered laser, telescopic camera equipment, and a notebook full of calculations based on the standard Earth curvature formulas he had learned in school. According to conventional geometry, a laser beam shot across a lake should demonstrate a specific amount of curvature drop over distance. The results of his experiments were deeply unsettling. At Horsetooth Reservoir, Marcus positioned his laser on the north shore and aimed it at a target on the south shore, approximately 6 miles away. According to Earth curvature calculations, the laser should have been approximately 24 feet below his target due to the planet's curve. Instead, the laser hit the target dead centre. Marcus repeated the experiment at 5 different lakes, each time achieving the same impossible result. The laser beams were travelling in straight lines across distances where Earth's curvature should have been clearly measurable. Either his equipment was malfunctioning, or the curvature he had been taught to expect simply wasn't there. 3 days after his final lake experiment, Marcus received another anonymous email. This time, it contained GPS coordinates for a location in northern Canada, along with a message. Others have done the same tests. We meet monthly. Come alone. Marcus hesitated for a week before booking a flight to Toronto. The coordinates led him to a small town called Moosonee, near the southern shore of Hudson Bay. He rented a car and drove to the specified location, a seemingly abandoned research station surrounded by snow-covered wilderness. Inside the building, Marcus found 7 other people seated around a conference table, covered with maps, photographs, and technical equipment. They introduced themselves as scientists, engineers, pilots, and researchers who had all discovered similar inconsistencies in Earth's supposed curvature. The group's leader was a woman named Elena Vasquez, a former cartographer who had worked for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for 15 years. Elena explained that she had first noticed discrepancies while creating coastal navigation charts in the early 2000s. Satellite data, ground surveys, and maritime reports kept contradicting each other, Elena said. When I brought these inconsistencies to my supervisors, I was told the equipment was malfunctioning or that I was making calculation errors, but the pattern was too consistent to be random mistakes. Elena showed Marcus dozens of examples where official maps showed curved coastlines and distances that didn't match real-world measurements. Ships reported travelling shorter distances than their charts indicated. Pilots found themselves reaching destinations ahead of schedule on routes that should have taken longer due to Earth's curvature. The more evidence we gathered, the more we realised we weren't dealing with isolated measurement errors, Elena continued. Someone has been systematically altering geographical data to make the world appear more curved than it actually is. Marcus shared his own research, including the Antarctic document and his laser experiments. The group listened intently, occasionally nodding in recognition when he described phenomena they had also encountered. A former surveyor named Thomas Wright explained that he had been fired from his job with the US Geological Survey after questioning discrepancies in land elevation measurements. A meteorologist named Catherine Lee described how weather prediction models only worked when she ignored official atmospheric curvature data and used flat plane calculations instead. The question, Eleanor said as the meeting concluded, is what are they hiding and why go to such lengths to hide it? Marcus left the meeting with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that he was part of something much larger than a simple geographical conspiracy. As his plane lifted off from Toronto, he stared out the window at the horizon, trying to see any evidence of the curve he'd been taught existed since childhood. The horizon looked completely flat. The breakthrough came in the form of an unexpected phone call 6 weeks later. Marcus was working late in his apartment when his phone rang, displaying a blocked number. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, making it impossible to identify the caller's gender or age. "Marcus Reed," the voice said. "You've been asking questions about Antarctica." Marcus's heart began pounding. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what you're looking for is real. Are you prepared to see it for yourself?" The caller explained that a private expedition was being organised for early December, summer in the southern hemisphere. The group would consist of Marcus and 2 other researchers who had been investigating similar anomalies. They would travel to Chile, then board a private vessel capable of ice navigation for a journey to the restricted zones beyond the 85th parallel. "This isn't a tourist trip," the voice warned. "The people who control access to that region don't want anyone seeing what's there. If we're caught, We'll be detained indefinitely under international security protocols. Are you willing to take that risk?" Marcus thought about James Patterson's trembling hands, Eleanor Vasquez's career destroyed by asking questions, and the months he had spent conducting experiments that defied everything he thought he knew about the planet. "Yes," he said, "I'll go." 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself on a plane to Santiago, Chile, carrying only essential cold weather gear and hidden recording equipment. His companions for the journey were Rebecca Torres, a physicist from UC Berkeley, who'd been investigating gravitational anomalies in polar regions, and David Kim, a former intelligence analyst who claimed to have discovered evidence of secret military installations in Antarctica. They met their guide, a grizzled Norwegian ship captain named Eric Larsen, at the port city of Punta Arenas. Larsen's vessel, the Aurora's Edge, was a modified icebreaker originally built for scientific research but now operating under private charter. Larsen himself was tight-lipped about who was funding their expedition, saying only that certain parties wanted them to document what they found. The journey south took 4 days through increasingly rough seas. As they approached the Antarctic convergence zone where cold polar waters meet warmer ocean currents, Marcus noticed his electronic equipment beginning to malfunction. His GPS unit displayed increasingly erratic readings, showing their position jumping between locations hundreds of miles apart. His digital compass spun wildly, unable to maintain a consistent bearing. Rebecca, monitoring gravitational readings with sensitive equipment, reported similar anomalies. "The magnetic field readings don't make sense," she said, studying her instruments with growing concern. "It's as if we were approaching an area where normal physics breaks down." On their 5th day at sea, they encountered the ice wall. Marcus had thought James Patterson's description was exaggerated, perhaps distorted by memory and fear. The reality was far more shocking than anything the former pilot had described. Rising from the dark Antarctic waters like a massive concrete barrier was a wall of ice that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions. The wall was not jagged and irregular, like natural glacial formations. It was remarkably smooth and vertical, rising at least 300 feet above the waterline. "This is impossible," David whispered, staring up at the towering ice formation. "Glaciers don't form vertical walls like this. The physics of ice formation wouldn't allow it." Captain Larsen had been unusually quiet since they first spotted the wall, but now he spoke up. "I've been making trips to Antarctic waters for 30 years, he said. "I've seen glaciers, ice sheets, and every natural formation you can imagine. This isn't natural. Someone built this." As the Aurora's Edge moved parallel to the ice wall, Marcus used his telephoto camera to document what they were seeing. The wall extended beyond the horizon in both directions, creating what appeared to be an impenetrable barrier around the entire Antarctic continent. But more disturbing than the wall itself were the signs of human activity they began to notice. Every few miles they spotted large metal structures embedded in the ice, what appeared to be observation towers equipped with radar dishes and communication equipment. David, using military-grade binoculars, identified armed personnel stationed at several of these installations. "Those are definitely military uniforms," he reported, "but I can't identify the nationality. The insignia don't match any country's armed forces that I'm familiar with." As they continued their journey along the ice wall, Rebecca made an even more unsettling discovery. Her gravitational measurement equipment, designed to detect variations in Earth's gravitational field, was showing readings that violated fundamental laws of physics. "According to these instruments," she said, her voice trembling, "the gravitational pull beyond this ice wall is significantly weaker than it should be. It's as if the mass of the planet just stops." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Antarctic air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if these readings are accurate, there's nothing beyond this wall. No land mass, no ocean floor, just empty space." That night, as they anchored the ship in a small inlet, Marcus reviewed the day's footage and photographs. Every image showed the same impossible sight, a perfectly constructed ice barrier that seemed designed to prevent anyone from seeing what lay beyond. The more he studied the evidence, the more one terrifying conclusion became unavoidable. The ice wall wasn't protecting Antarctica from the outside world. It was protecting the outside world from discovering what wasn't there. Captain Larson woke them before dawn with urgent whispers. "We have a window," he said, his weathered face grim in the dim light of the cabin. "My contacts report that the patrol schedule has a gap between 0500 and 0630. If we're going to find a way through the wall, it has to be now." Marcus, Rebecca and David quickly gathered their equipment and followed Larson onto the ship's deck. The captain had spotted what appeared to be a narrow channel in the ice wall, barely wide enough for their vessel to navigate. Ice formations often shifted due to temperature changes and ocean currents, but this opening seemed too perfectly positioned to be natural. "It could be a trap," David warned, scanning the surrounding ice with his binoculars. "If someone wanted to lure us into a restricted zone, this would be the perfect way to do it." "We didn't come this far to turn back now," Marcus replied, though his own instincts were screaming warnings. "We need to see what's on the other side." As the Aurora's Edge slowly navigated through the narrow channel, Marcus noticed that the ice walls on either side showed clear evidence of artificial modification. Tool marks were visible in the frozen surfaces, and the opening maintained a consistent width that would have been impossible for natural ice formation. Beyond the channel, they emerged into an area unlike anything any of them had expected to find. Instead of more ice or the Antarctic continent, they found themselves in a vast open space, surrounded by the ice wall on all sides. The area was roughly circular, perhaps 20 miles in diameter, and contained what appeared to be a massive research installation. The facility consisted of dozens of buildings, communications towers, aircraft landing strips, and what looked like mining operations. But most unsettling of all was what lay beyond the research installation, a massive opening in what should have been the ground. Marcus positioned his telephoto camera and began documenting everything they could see. The opening was perfectly circular, perhaps 2 miles in diameter, and appeared to be artificially constructed with metal reinforcements around its edges. Powerful lights illuminated the opening's perimeter, but the interior was so dark that even with Marcus's best equipment, he couldn't see the bottom. "That's not a natural geological formation," Rebecca said, studying the scene through binoculars. "Someone excavated that opening. The question is why and how deep it goes." David was monitoring radio frequencies, trying to intercept communications from the research facility. "I'm picking up transmissions in multiple languages," he reported. "English, Russian, Chinese, and what sounds like German. This isn't a single country's operation, it's international." As they watched from a distance of several miles, they could see vehicles and personnel moving around the facility. Aircraft regularly landed and took off from the airstrips, and massive cranes appeared to be lowering equipment into the circular opening. "Look at the edge of that hole," Rebecca said suddenly, pointing toward the massive excavation. "Do you see those structures?" Marcus adjusted his camera's focus and felt his stomach drop. Around the perimeter of the opening were what appeared to be massive anchoring systems, enormous metal cables and support structures that seemed designed to prevent something from falling. "It's as if they're holding the land in place," Marcus whispered, the implications hitting him like a physical blow, as if without those anchors, everything would just fall. Rebecca's gravitational equipment was providing readings that defied explanation. According to her instruments, the gravitational pull at the edge of the opening dropped to nearly zero, then reversed entirely, as if gravity was pulling upward rather than downward. "This is impossible," she said, checking and rechecking her equipment. "Gravity doesn't work this way." There's no scientific explanation for these readings. David had managed to intercept a radio transmission from the facility. The message was brief, but chilling. "Perimeter breach detected in Sector 7. Unknown vessel beyond the ice wall. Initiate containment protocol immediately." "We need to leave," Captain Larson said urgently. "Now." But as the Aurora's Edge turned toward the narrow channel through which they had entered, they discovered their escape route had been blocked. A large military vessel now occupied the opening, and additional ships were approaching from multiple directions. Marcus continued photographing and filming everything they could see as the military vessels closed in. His camera captured images of personnel wearing uniforms, without national insignia, Sophisticated weapon systems, unlike anything in conventional military arsenals, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be aircraft using propulsion systems that produced no visible exhaust or sound. "Whatever this place is," Marcus said, still recording, "it's not just about hiding Earth's shape. They're hiding technology that's decades ahead of anything the public knows exists." As the military vessels surrounded them, Rebecca made one final observation that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. "The gravitational readings," she said, staring at her instruments in disbelief. "According to these measurements, we're not on Earth anymore. The gravitational signature is completely different." "What do you mean?" David asked. "I mean," Rebecca replied, her voice barely a whisper, "that either my equipment is completely malfunctioning, or we've somehow travelled to a different planet." The boarding party from the military vessels consisted of armed personnel in full combat gear, who spoke no words as they confiscated all recording equipment, detained Marcus and his companions, and placed black bags over their heads. As Marcus felt himself being transferred to one of the military ships, his last coherent thought was a terrifying realization. They hadn't discovered that Earth was flat. They had discovered something far worse, that Earth, as humanity understood it, might not exist at all. Marcus awoke in what appeared to be a medical facility, though unlike any hospital he had ever seen. The walls were pristine white, the lighting was perfectly even without visible sources, and the air carried a sterile quality that seemed artificially maintained. He was lying on an examination table, wearing a hospital gown with no memory of how he had gotten there. A woman in a white coat entered the room, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of neutral expression Marcus associated with government officials. She appeared to be in her 40s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate Marcus as if he were a specimen rather than a person. "Mr. Reed," she said, settling into a chair beside his bed. "I'm Agent Sarah Collins with the Antarctic Treaty Enforcement Division. You've been unconscious for 3 days following your unauthorized incursion into restricted Antarctic territory." Marcus tried to sit up but discovered his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. "What did you do to me? Where are my companions?" "You suffered severe hypothermia and altitude sickness during your expedition," Agent Collins replied, consulting her tablet. "Your companions are receiving similar medical treatment. You're fortunate to be alive." Marcus's mind was foggy, but he retained clear memories of what they had discovered beyond the ice wall. "That's not what happened. We found the research facility, the excavation site, the gravitational anomalies. I have it all documented." Agent Collins showed him a collection of photographs and video files on her tablet. They showed the Aurora's edge approaching the ice wall, but beyond that, the images showed nothing but empty ocean and natural ice formations. According to the footage, their expedition had encountered nothing more unusual than typical Antarctic scenery. "Your recording equipment was damaged by the extreme cold," Agent Collins explained. "These are the only images that were recoverable. As you can see, you found exactly what we would expect in that region. Ice, water, and natural geological formations." Marcus stared at the sanitized footage in disbelief. Every image of the research facility, the circular excavation, and the impossible gravitational readings had been replaced with mundane Antarctic scenery. Either his memory was completely unreliable, or someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to alter the evidence. "I know what I saw," Marcus insisted. "The facility, the technology, the opening in the ground." Rebecca's gravitational readings showed dash. "Miss Torres suffered a severe concussion during your expedition," Agent Collins interrupted. "Her equipment malfunctioned due to extreme weather conditions. Mr. Kim experienced similar disorientation. All 3 of you were affected by altitude sickness and hypothermia, which commonly cause hallucinations and false memories." Agent Collins leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "Mr. Reed, you've stumbled into a situation that involves international security protocols. The Antarctic Treaty strictly prohibits unauthorized civilian access to certain regions for very good reasons. The area you entered contains hazardous geological formations and extreme weather conditions that have killed dozens of researchers over the years." She showed him documents detailing his expedition's official record. According to the files, Marcus, Rebecca and David had hired Captain Larson for a routine Antarctic tourism trip that had gone dangerously off course due to equipment failure and poor weather. They had been rescued by international treaty enforcement personnel before dying of exposure. "You're free to return home," Agent Collins concluded, "but you'll need to sign documentation, acknowledging that you understand the national security implications of spreading false information about classified Antarctic operations. The penalty for violating this agreement is indefinite detention under international security protocols." Marcus was released 2 days later and flown back to Denver. His first instinct was to contact Rebecca and David, but he discovered that both of their phone numbers had been disconnected. Rebecca's university had no record of her ever being employed there, and David's intelligence background had been completely scrubbed from all accessible databases. When Marcus returned to his apartment, he found that his research materials had been returned by building management after a water leak had required access to his unit. Months of documents, photographs, and experimental data had been replaced with generic conspiracy theory materials that made his work appear to be the obsessions of a paranoid fantasist rather than legitimate research. Marcus attempted to contact Captain Larson, but discovered that the Aurora's Edge had been sold to an unnamed buyer, and Larson had reportedly moved to a remote location in Norway where he could not be reached. Elena Vasquez and the other researchers from the Canadian meeting had also vanished. Their email addresses were invalid, their phone numbers disconnected, and online searches turned up no trace of their existence. Most unsettling of all, Marcus began experiencing memory problems. Details of his Antarctic expedition became increasingly fuzzy, and he found himself questioning whether the extraordinary things he remembered had actually happened. When he tried to write down his experiences, he discovered that he couldn't clearly recall important specifics about the research facility or the circular excavation. 3 weeks after his return, Marcus received a final email from the anonymous sender who had originally contacted him. The message was brief. "The truth has been contained. Your service is no longer required. Any further investigation will result in permanent resolution." Marcus realized that he had been faced with a choice: accept the official explanation and live with the knowledge that his memories might be false, or continue pursuing the truth and risk disappearing entirely like his companions. He chose a third option. 6 months later, Marcus uploaded a video to multiple online platforms simultaneously. The file was encrypted, distributed through anonymous servers, and designed to be nearly impossible to remove completely from the internet. In the video, Marcus appeared tired and gaunt, speaking directly to the camera from an undisclosed location. "My name is Marcus Reed," he began, "and I'm probably going to disappear after releasing this message. 6 months ago, I discovered something about our planet that certain people don't want you to know. I can't prove everything I'm about to tell you, because most of my evidence has been destroyed or altered, but I can give you enough information to investigate for yourself." Marcus described his research into Antarctic anomalies, the declassified documents he had received, and the experiments he had conducted that suggested Earth's curvature was not what people believed. He provided GPS coordinates for locations where others could replicate his laser experiments, and detailed instructions for identifying the inconsistencies in satellite imagery that had first led him to question official geographical data. "I'm not asking you to believe me," Marcus continued. "I'm asking you to look for yourselves. Test the horizon with your own equipment. Question why certain areas of Antarctica are forbidden to civilian access. Ask why weather prediction models work better when you ignore Earth's supposed curvature." The video concluded with Marcus staring directly into the camera, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "They've convinced most of you that people like me are crazy conspiracy theorists. Maybe I am. Maybe everything I experienced was hallucinations caused by altitude sickness and hypothermia. But if I'm right, then everything you've been taught about the world is a carefully constructed lie designed to prevent you from discovering a truth so shocking that it would fundamentally change human civilization." Marcus paused, then delivered his final words. "Sometimes the truth isn't round, it's sharper than you think. And sometimes the edge of the world is exactly where they tell you it isn't. The video was viewed over 2 million times in its first week online before being removed by platform administrators for violating community guidelines regarding misinformation. But copies continued to appear on alternative platforms, and Marcus's story began inspiring others to conduct their own investigations. 3 weeks after the video's release, Marcus Reed's apartment was found empty. Neighbours reported that he had left early one morning carrying a single suitcase and had never returned. His landlord found a note on his desk with a single line of text: "Gone to find the edge. Don't follow." To this day, no one knows what happened to Marcus Reed. His research has inspired a growing community of independent investigators who claim to have replicated his experiments and discovered similar anomalies. Government agencies continue to deny that any classified Antarctic operations exist beyond routine scientific research. But on clear days, when you stand at the ocean's edge and stare at the horizon, you might find yourself wondering the same question that consumed Marcus Reed. What if everything you see is exactly what someone wants you to see? And what if the truth about the world beneath your feet is sharper, stranger, and more terrifying than you ever imagined? The search for answers continues, but those who look too closely often find that the edge of the world is also the edge of everything they thought they knew about reality itself. What if the most powerful secret society in the world wasn't hiding their evil plans, but keeping something far worse from awakening? Tonight's chilling tale takes us deep into the redwood forests of California, where ancient rituals and modern power collide in ways you never imagined. Special thanks to Langalman for suggesting this spine-tingling concept. If you have ideas for future stories, drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these midnight journeys into the unknown, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more tales that blur the line between conspiracy and nightmare. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between my electric bill and a stack of rejection letters from publishers who wouldn't touch my work anymore. Plain white paper, no return address, postmarked from San Francisco but feeling like it had travelled much farther than the 300 miles from the city. My name was written in careful block letters across the front. ALEXMORGAN. Nothing else. No apartment number, though whoever sent it knew exactly where to find me in this cramped studio above the Chinese restaurant on Divisadero Street. I'd been blacklisted for 18 months now, ever since I published that expose on Meridian Industries and their illegal arms deals with 3 different terror groups. The story won awards, toppled a senator, and destroyed my career in equal measure. Turns out some truths are too expensive for the media to handle. The lawsuit bankrupted the magazine, my editor disappeared into witness protection, and I became radioactive to every publication from the Chronicle to Mother Jones. But someone still thought I was worth reaching. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of cream-coloured paper, expensive stock, with an embossed header that made my hands shake. The Bohemian Club, San Francisco. Below that, an invitation written in the same careful script. Mr. Alex Morgan is cordially invited to attend the summer encampment at Bohemian Grove, Monterey, California, July 15th to 31st, 2024. Guest privileges have been arranged. Transportation and accommodation provided. This invitation is non-transferable and expires at sundown on July 15th. At the bottom, written in different handwriting, rushed, urgent, was a single line that would haunt me for weeks. This is your last chance to see the truth. Don't waste it. Bohemian Grove. I'd heard whispers, read the conspiracy theories, seen the grainy photos leaked over the years. Every July, the most powerful men in America, presidents, CEOs, generals, media moguls, retreated to 2,700 acres of ancient redwoods north of San Francisco for 2 weeks of what they called fellowship, what the rest of the world called the most secretive gathering of the American elite. No journalists allowed, no cameras, no women, no record of what happened behind those gates, except for the occasional leaked photo of men in robes standing before a massive owl statue, performing something called the Cremation of Care ceremony. Political theatre, most assumed. Rich men playing dress-up while they planned the next war or market crash. But this invitation was real. The paper felt authentic. The letterhead matched samples I'd seen in archived documents. Someone with serious connections wanted me inside those gates. The question was why. I spent 3 days researching everything I could find about the Grove. The official history spoke of artistic pursuits, informal talks, and male bonding among the country's leadership. The unofficial history painted darker pictures: secret deals, occult rituals, decisions that shaped global politics made during drunken conversations around campfires. The most disturbing accounts came from the few infiltrators who'd made it inside over the decades. They described the opening ceremony where members dressed as druids and burned an effigy called Care before a giant concrete owl. They spoke of lakeside talks where defence contractors pitched new weapons to Pentagon officials, of quiet conversations that preceded major policy announcements, of a casual corruption so normalised it felt like summer camp for sociopaths. But none of them had stayed long. Most were caught and expelled within days. The security was too tight, the members too paranoid, the stakes too high for any real investigation. Whoever sent this invitation was giving me something no journalist had ever possessed: legitimate access. The question was whether I was walking into the story of a lifetime or a trap that would finish what Meridian Industries had started. On the morning of July 14th, I made my decision. I packed light, a small camera hidden in my toiletry kit, a digital recorder disguised as an inhaler, a notebook I could claim was for poetry if questioned, everything that might help me document what happened behind those gates. The invitation included a phone number. When I called, a woman's voice gave me an address in Santa Rosa and told me to be there by 6 p.m. sharp. No other details, no explanation of who had arranged this or what they expected in return. I drove north through wine country as the sun set, watching the hills turn gold and purple in the fading light. The address led to a small parking lot behind a defunct gas station. 3 black SUVs waited, engines running, windows tinted. A man in a plain suit approached my car before I'd even turned off the engine. "Morgan?" he asked. I nodded. "Leave your keys in the ignition. Someone will return your car when you're finished." "Finished with what?" He didn't answer, just opened the passenger door of the middle SUV and waited. I grabbed my bag and climbed in, noting the soundproof partition between front and back seats, the lack of door handles on the interior. Whatever was happening, there would be no turning back once we started moving. The drive took 40 minutes through increasingly dense forest. No conversation, no music, just the hum of tyres on asphalt and the gradual realisation that I was committing to something I didn't understand. My phone lost signal after the first 10 minutes. The windows were too dark to see landmarks. By the time we stopped, I had no idea where we were or how to get back. The gates of Bohemian Grove appeared suddenly in our headlights. Massive wooden barriers flanked by stone pillars, with the carved image of an owl watching from above. Guards emerged from hidden positions, checked documents, waved us through. The SUV followed a winding road deeper into the forest, past smaller camps with names like Hillbillies and Lost Angels painted on rustic signs. We stopped at a cluster of simple cabins near what appeared to be a lake. The man in the suit handed me a small leather folder. "Your documentation," he said. "You're a guest of the Mandalay camp. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your eyes open. Someone will contact you when it's time. Time for what? But he was already walking back to the SUV. I watched the taillights disappear into the trees, leaving me alone in the most secretive place in America with nothing but a fake identity, and questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Inside the leather folder was a camp roster listing me as a Morgan, Investment Banking, Chicago. Below that was a simple map of the Grove and a schedule of events. Tomorrow night was marked in red. Cremation of Care ceremony, 9:30 p.m, Sacred Grove. At the bottom of the page, in the same urgent handwriting from the invitation, was one final note. Watch for the second ceremony. That's where the real truth begins. The morning brought sounds I'd never expected to hear in such a place. Laughter, casual conversation, the clink of coffee cups on saucers. Looking out the window of my assigned cabin, I saw men who controlled trillions of dollars and millions of lives shuffling around in bathrobes and flip-flops like they were at a summer camp. Because that's exactly what it was, I realised. The most exclusive, powerful summer camp in the world. I dressed in the khakis and polo shirt that had been left in my closet, the Grove's unofficial uniform, and stepped outside to explore. The camp sprawled across the forest in a seemingly random pattern of paths and clearings, each dedicated to different groups with names that sounded like fraternity houses. Caveman, Silverado, Owl's Nest, Sons of Toil. At the central plaza I found what looked like a small town square, a dining hall large enough for hundreds, a stage for performances, a bar that was already serving despite the early hour. Men moved between these spaces with the easy familiarity of those who'd done this many times before. Some faces I recognised from television and magazine covers. Senators, CEOS, a former Secretary of State. Others were anonymous but carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from wielding serious power. The strangest part was how normal it all felt. These were the people conspiracy theorists claimed ran secret cabals to control world events, and they were arguing about baseball scores and complaining about their golf games like any group of aging fraternity brothers. First time at the Grove? I turned to find a heavy-set man in his 60s, silver hair perfectly styled despite the casual setting. His face was familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. "That obvious?" I asked. He laughed. "You've got that wide-eyed look. Everyone does their first time. I'm Bill. Been coming here for 23 years. Alex, investment banking. Right. Mandalay camp. Heard you were joining us. What brings you to our little retreat?" It was a casual question, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't casual at all. I'd prepared for this. "Market analysis consultant," I said. "Specialised in political risk assessment. Figured this might be a good place to network." Bill nodded slowly. "Indeed it is. You'll want to catch tonight's ceremony if you haven't seen it before. Quite a spectacle. Been the same for nearly a century now. The owl thing, cremation of care. Beautiful tradition. Helps everyone leave their worries behind, focus on fellowship." He paused, studying my face. "Though I suspect you might find other aspects of our gathering more professionally relevant." Before I could ask what he meant, Bill was walking away, leaving me with the distinct impression that I'd just passed some kind of test. I spent the day observing, noting the casual interactions between men whose public relationships were supposedly adversarial. A Democratic senator sharing drinks with a Republican defense contractor, a tech CEO deep in conversation with someone I was pretty sure ran the NSA, a former president holding court near the lake, surrounded by media executives who hung on his every word. This was where real policy got made, I realised. Not in committee meetings or official negotiations, but in these informal moments between men who'd known each other for decades. The Grove was a lubricant for American power, a place where opposing sides could find common ground away from cameras and constituents. As afternoon turned to evening, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations became more hushed, more urgent. Staff members appeared with cases of equipment I couldn't identify. The lake area was cordoned off with rope barriers. Whatever was happening tonight, it was bigger than casual networking. At sunset, I joined the stream of men walking toward the sacred grove, a natural amphitheatre carved into the hillside dominated by the famous owl statue. 40 feet tall, carved from concrete, with burning eyes that watched over everything. Hundreds of folding chairs faced a small stage where men in hooded robes were preparing props I couldn't make out in the growing darkness. The ceremony began with music, a choir hidden in the trees, singing something that sounded like a funeral dirge. Then came the procession, 24 men in flowing robes, carrying torches, escorting what appeared to be a small coffin draped in black cloth. A voice boomed from speakers hidden throughout the forest, narrating the death of Care and its cremation before the great owl. The robed figures placed the coffin on a pyre and set it ablaze while the choir reached a crescendo. Flames leaped toward the owl's glowing eyes as hundreds of the world's most powerful men watched in reverent silence. It should have been absurd. Grown men playing dress-up, performing amateur theatre in the woods. Instead, it felt genuinely eerie. Something about the ancient trees, the flickering shadows, the synchronized movement of so many people participating in a ritual most of them probably didn't fully understand. Then the lights went out. Not just the ceremonial flames, everything. The owl's eyes went dark, the hidden speakers went silent, even the subtle path lighting I'd barely noticed disappeared. We were plunged into absolute darkness, hundreds of men sitting in chairs carved into a hillside with no way to see where they were going. But instead of panic or confusion, there was silence. Complete unnatural silence. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. It was as if the entire gathering had been frozen in place. I waited for someone to call for help, for flashlights to appear, for the normal response to a power outage. Instead, I heard something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Footsteps. Measured, deliberate, moving through the crowd with impossible precision despite the darkness. The footsteps stopped near the front of the amphitheatre. Then came a voice, speaking in what sounded like Latin, words I couldn't understand but that seemed to resonate in my chest. Other voices joined in, creating a chant that built and built until it felt like the forest itself was vibrating with sound. This wasn't part of the official ceremony, this was something else entirely. The chanting stopped as abruptly as it had begun. A few seconds later the lights returned. Owl's eyes blazing, speakers crackling back to life, the master of ceremonies continuing his narration as if nothing had happened. The spell was broken, men began talking and moving again. The formal ceremony concluded with applause and casual conversation. But as we filed out of the sacred grove, I noticed something that chilled me. At least 24 men weren't heading back to the camps with everyone else. Instead, they were walking deeper into the forest, following a path I hadn't noticed before. All of them carried small flashlights, and all of them moved with the purposeful direction of people who knew exactly where they were going. I hung back, letting the main crowd pass, then followed the breakaway group at a distance. They were easy to track. The flashlight beams bobbed through the trees like fireflies, leading toward a part of the grove I hadn't seen on any map. The path wound uphill for nearly half a mile before opening into a smaller clearing I would never have found on my own. Here, hidden from the main camp by dense forest, was a second amphitheatre. Older, more primitive, carved from natural rock formations rather than built from concrete and steel. At the centre stood not an owl but a stone altar, covered with symbols I didn't recognise. The 24 men formed a circle around it, no longer in ceremonial robes but in simple black clothing. They were chanting again, but this time I could make out some of the words. English mixed with Latin, speaking of binding and containment, of keeping something sleeping, of maintaining the barriers that held back chaos. As they chanted, one man stepped forward with something I definitely hadn't expected to see. A wooden crate, old and weathered, marked with symbols and what appeared to be a date from the 1940s. This was the real ceremony. Everything at the sacred grove had been theatre for the masses. This was why I'd been invited, why someone wanted a journalist to witness what happened in the shadows of America's most secretive gathering. I pressed closer, trying to see what was in the crate, but the trees blocked my view. All I could make out were the chanted words, growing more urgent now, in the sense that something ancient and dangerous was being carefully, deliberately contained. Then one of the men looked directly at me. The man who spotted me was younger than the others, maybe 45. with the lean build of someone who stayed in shape despite spending his days behind a desk. In the flickering torchlight, I couldn't make out his face clearly, but his posture suggested military training. He raised a hand and the chanting stopped instantly. "We have a visitor," he said, voice carrying easily across the clearing. I considered running, but there was nowhere to go. The path back was too narrow, too winding, and I'd never find my way in the dark. Instead, I stepped forward into the light, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Alex Morgan," I said. "Mandalay Camp, I was just—" "You were just following us," the man interrupted. "Question is why?" An older man emerged from the circle, someone I now recognised as a former defence secretary, whose tenure had spanned 3 administrations. His presence here transformed this from concerning to terrifying. These weren't just wealthy eccentrics playing games. These were people who controlled military budgets and intelligence operations. "Show him," the defence secretary said simply. 2 men stepped aside, giving me a clear view of the stone altar. The surface was covered with carved symbols that looked far older than anything else in the grove, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the torchlight. The wooden crate sat at the centre, its lid partially open to reveal something that gleamed metallic in the flickering light. "Do you know what you're looking at, Mr. Morgan?" the defence secretary asked. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. "Project Owl," he continued, "started in 1943, continued in various forms ever since. The Grove isn't just a social club, it's a containment facility." "Containment for what?" The younger man laughed, but there was no humour in it. "You wouldn't believe us if we told you. Hell, most of the members don't know. They think they're here for networking and male bonding. The cremation of care is just pageantry to them, a quaint tradition with symbolic meaning. But the real ceremony," I gestured toward the altar, "is about keeping something very old, very powerful and very dangerous from waking up," the defence secretary finished. "The owl isn't a symbol we worship, Mr. Morgan. It's a prison we maintain." They were all watching me now, measuring my reaction, waiting to see how I'd process what they were telling me. Part of me wanted to laugh. This sounded like the fever dreams of conspiracy theorists, ancient evils and shadow governments and occult containment protocols. But the setting was too real, the participants too credible, the ritual I'd witnessed too elaborate to be fiction. "What's in the crate?" I asked. "The original binding artifacts," said a woman's voice from behind me. I spun around to find someone who definitely hadn't been there moments before. A woman in her 70s, silver hair pulled back severely, wearing clothes that managed to look both practical and expensive. Her presence violated everything I knew about the Grove's men-only policy. "Eleanor Hartwell," she said, extending a hand. "I've been managing Project Owl since 1987. Women aren't allowed. In the social aspects, no. But some secrets are too important for gender politics." She moved past me to examine the crate's contents. These were recovered from a Nazi expedition to Tibet in 1943. The SS Ahnenerbe thought they'd found artifacts that could summon and control ancient powers. They were half right. She lifted something from the crate, a metal disc covered with the same spiralling symbols as the altar, but these seemed to move on their own, shifting and changing as I watched. "The Tibetan monks who originally possessed these weren't trying to summon anything," Eleanor continued. "They were trying to keep something asleep. When Hitler's occultists broke the original binding, they didn't gain power. They released something that had been contained for centuries." "What kind of something?" the defence secretary answered. "Call it what you like. Ancient god, interdimensional entity, primordial force of chaos. The names don't matter. What matters is what it does when it's free." He gestured, and one of the other men brought out a tablet computer incongruous in this setting of torches and stone altars. The screen showed a map of the world with red markers scattered across it. "Every time the binding weakens, we see spikes in seemingly random catastrophic events," he explained. "Political assassinations, market crashes, natural disasters, terrorist attacks. Not caused directly, but influenced. Chaos spreads like a virus when certain barriers are down. The Grove was established here because of the natural properties of these particular redwoods," Eleanor added. "Old growth forests have natural resonance with certain types of, let's call them spiritual phenomena. The founding members didn't understand the science, but they recognized the effect. The annual gathering, the rituals, the focused attention of powerful minds, it all serves to reinforce the containment. And the cremation of care is a distraction, the younger man said. Theatre for the masses while we handle the real work. Most of the members genuinely believe they're here for fellowship and networking. The inner circle knows better. I looked around the group, trying to count how many people were part of this inner circle. Maybe 30 total, out of the thousands who'd attended Grove encampments over the decades. A shadow organisation within a secret society, managing what they claimed was an existential threat to human civilization. "Why tell me this?" I asked. "Why invite a journalist?" Eleanor and the Defence Secretary exchanged glances. Something passed between them, a decision being made in real time. "Because we're dying off," Eleanor said finally. "The knowledge, the responsibility, the burden, it's all been passed down through personal relationships for 80 years. But the world has changed. The people with the power and resources to maintain the containment aren't necessarily the people we can trust with the truth." New money doesn't understand old responsibilities, the Defence Secretary added. Tech billionaires, crypto moguls, social media executives, they have the influence we need, but they think everything can be solved with apps and algorithms. They don't believe in things that can't be quantified. "So you need documentation," I realised. "A record of what really happens here. Insurance in case the oral tradition breaks down." "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "But it has to be someone outside the power structure. Someone with credibility and investigative skills. Someone who's already proven they'll publish dangerous truths regardless of personal cost." She meant my Meridian Industries exposé. This was why I'd been blacklisted and then mysteriously invited. They needed a journalist who demonstrated willingness to sacrifice their career for a story. "What happens if the binding fails completely?" I asked. The group fell silent. Finally, the younger man spoke. "Look at any period of sustained global chaos in human history. The fall of Rome, the Black Death, the World Wars, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Times when multiple systems failed simultaneously, when cause and effect stopped making sense, when it felt like the world was coming apart at the seams. Those were natural historical processes." "Were they?" Eleanor interrupted. "Or were they what happens when humanity loses the ability to maintain certain spiritual defences? The monks who originally bound this thing warned that it feeds on conflict and confusion. The more chaos it causes, the stronger it becomes, until the binding fails entirely." She returned the metal disc to the crate and closed the lid carefully. "The ceremony you just witnessed reinforces the containment for another year," she said, "but each time it gets harder. The original artifacts are degrading, the knowledge is fragmenting, and the world is changing in ways that make traditional approaches less effective." "How long do we have?" "Unknown," the Defence Secretary admitted. "Could be decades, could be years, could be tomorrow if something goes wrong. That's why we need someone on the outside, someone who can document not just what we do, but why we do it. Insurance for the future." As if summoned by his words, a low rumble echoed through the forest. Not thunder, the sky was clear. Something deeper, more primal, like the earth itself was groaning. The torches flickered, and for a moment the carved symbols on the altar seemed to glow with their own light. Then everything went still again. "Time to go," Eleanor said quietly. "The ceremony's complete, but the effects can be unpredictable for the first few hours." The group began dispersing, each member taking a different path back through the forest. Within minutes, I was alone with Eleanor and the Defence Secretary, the altar dark and silent again. "There's more to see," Eleanor told me, "but not tonight. Tomorrow, if you're serious about this responsibility, we'll show you the archives, the complete record of Project Owl going back to its inception. And if I'm not serious, then you'll have an interesting story about rich men playing games in the woods," the Defence Secretary said, which is what 90% of the attendees would tell you anyway. They walked away in different directions, leaving me standing alone beside the stone altar. The forest felt different now. Not threatening exactly, but aware, as if something vast and patient was watching from between the trees, held in check by forces I was only beginning to understand. I found my way back to Mandalay Camp by following the distant sound of laughter from the main plaza. Men were still awake, drinking and talking around campfires, processing the evening's official ceremony. To them, it had been a meaningful but ultimately symbolic ritual. They had no idea what had happened in the hidden clearing, no sense that their casual gathering served a purpose beyond networking and tradition. Back in my cabin, I sat on the narrow bed and tried to process what I'd experienced. Every instinct I'd developed as a journalist screamed that this was elaborate nonsense. Powerful people telling themselves comforting stories about their importance, dressing up their influence in mystical language to avoid confronting the mundane reality of politics and economics. But the metal disc had moved on its own. The forest had responded to the completion of their ritual, and the people involved weren't the kind who needed to invent elaborate fantasies to feel important. They already controlled most of the world's power and resources. Either I'd stumbled into the most sophisticated hoax in human history, or I'd been invited to document something that made every conspiracy theory I'd ever dismissed seem quaint by comparison. Tomorrow I'd get to see the archives. Tomorrow I'd learn whether Project Owl was an elaborate delusion or the most important secret in the world. Either way, my life as I knew it was over. I barely slept. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. Branches creaking in the wind, night birds calling to each other, the distant murmur of late-night conversations from other camps. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with spinning metal discs and watching eyes carved from stone. Eleanor found me at breakfast, appearing beside my table in the dining hall as if she'd materialised from thin air. In daylight, she looked like any other well-preserved socialite who might attend charity galas in Pacific Heights. The kind of woman whose presence at an all-male retreat would be explained as someone's eccentric aunt, who'd been grandfathered in through family connections. "Ready for the historical tour?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "Is that what we're calling it? The other guests think you're researching the Grove's role in American political history, which isn't entirely untrue." She sipped her coffee, eyes scanning the dining hall. "Most of them will be occupied with golf and lake activities today. Perfect time for a deeper education." We walked through the main camp area, past men reading newspapers and debating policy like they were at any expensive resort. Eleanor kept up a stream of casual conversation about Grove traditions and notable members, playing her part as tour guide. But I noticed she was leading us away from the popular areas, towards sections of the forest I hadn't seen before. "The Grove covers nearly 3,000 acres, she explained as we walked. "Most guests never venture beyond the central few hundred. Why would they? The camps, the lake, the dining facilities, everything they need for their retreat is concentrated in one area. But the rest of the property serves other purposes." We'd been walking for almost 20 minutes when she stopped beside what appeared to be a maintenance shed. Weathered wood siding, corrugated metal roof, the kind of utilitarian structure that becomes invisible once you've seen it. Eleanor produced a key and opened the padlock on the door. Inside, the shed was bigger than it appeared from outside, extending back into the hillside. What I'd taken for a simple storage building was actually a facade hiding a much larger underground facility. Fluorescent lights flickered on as we descended a concrete staircase that went down much deeper than should have been possible. "Built during the Cold War," Eleanor explained, her voice echoing in the narrow stairwell. "Officially, it's an emergency shelter for continuity of government operations. Unofficially, it houses the most complete archive of Project Owl materials outside of certain classified Pentagon files." The stairs ended at a steel door marked with radiation warnings and biohazard symbols. Eleanor placed her palm on a scanner that seemed decades newer than the rest of the facility. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing something that took my breath away. The archive stretched out in all directions, a vast underground chamber carved from the bedrock beneath the grove. Metal shelving units reached toward a ceiling lost in shadows, each one packed with boxes, files, artifacts and equipment I couldn't begin to identify. Climate control systems hummed quietly, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity for materials that spanned nearly 8 decades of secret research. "Welcome to the real history of the 20th century, Eleanor said. She led me past shelves of documents in German, Russian, Chinese, and languages I didn't recognise. Maps marked with symbols similar to what I'd seen on the altar. Photographs of archaeological expeditions to remote locations around the world. Technical specifications for devices that looked like they belonged in science fiction movies. After we recovered the original Nazi materials in 1943, President Roosevelt authorised a classified research programme, Eleanor explained, pulling a thick file from one of the shelves. The scientists involved were initially sceptical. Einstein himself consulted on the project for 6 months before concluding that the artefacts operated according to principles beyond current physics. She opened the file, revealing handwritten notes in what I recognised as Einstein's distinctive script. Mathematical equations filled page after page, interspersed with frustrated observations about phenomena that violate fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. What did he conclude? That the universe is far stranger than we assumed, and that consciousness might play a more active role in physical processes than anyone wanted to admit. Eleanor closed the Einstein file and pulled out another one marked Tibet Expedition 1944 to 1947. We sent teams back to find the original source of the artefacts, learn how the binding process actually worked. The photographs in this file showed Western archaeologists working alongside Tibetan monks in monasteries that looked untouched by modernity. But what caught my attention were the images of stone chambers carved deep into mountain faces, filled with artefacts identical to what I'd seen the night before. The monks weren't surprised to see us, Eleanor continued. They'd been expecting someone to come asking questions about what the Germans had stolen. According to their records, this wasn't the first time the binding had been broken and had to be re-established. How many times? At least 7 documented instances over the past millennium. Each time, the disruption led to a period of sustained chaos. Wars, plagues, social collapse. The monks developed their containment techniques through trial and error over centuries. She showed me translation documents, painstakingly decoded texts that described rituals similar to what I'd witnessed, but far more complex. The Tibetan methods involved dozens of practitioners working in carefully coordinated groups, maintaining the binding through constant vigilance and regular reinforcement ceremonies. The Grove's founders didn't understand the underlying principles, Eleanor admitted. They just knew that gathering powerful, influential people together for focused ritual activities seemed to have a stabilising effect on certain phenomena. We moved deeper into the archive, past sections devoted to different decades of research. I saw files on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam War, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, all marked with notations about containment stress and binding fluctuations. Major historical events correlate with weaknesses in the containment, Eleanor explained. Sometimes the stress is caused by the events themselves. Global conflicts generate the kind of chaos that feeds the entity. Sometimes it's the reverse. Containment failures create conditions that make conflicts more likely. Chicken and egg. Exactly. Which is why prevention became our focus rather than reaction. She stopped at a section of the archive devoted to technology development. Here were prototypes of devices that looked decades ahead of anything I'd seen in the outside world. Machines that supposedly measured spiritual resonance and metaphysical field fluctuations. Computer models attempting to quantify something that traditional science insisted didn't exist. The hardest part has always been bridging the gap between ancient knowledge and modern capabilities, Eleanor said, picking up a device that looked like a cross between a spectrometer and a Geiger counter. The monks' techniques worked, but they required lifelong training and cultural conditions that don't exist in the modern world. We needed methods that could be implemented by people with day jobs and families. Hence the Grove. Annual gatherings of influential people, focused ritual activities, enough genuine belief and emotional investment to create the necessary resonance. She set down the device and looked at me seriously. But it's a band-aid solution, and we all know it. The original binding required full-time practitioners working in optimal conditions. We're trying to maintain something incredibly complex and dangerous using part-time amateurs. We reached the centre of the archive, where a circular area had been cleared for what appeared to be a viewing room. Multiple monitors displayed real-time data streams, seismic readings, atmospheric measurements, and more esoteric graphs tracking things labelled psychic resonance and entity containment levels. This is where we monitor the binding stability, Eleanor explained, settling into one of the chairs facing the displays. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The moment something starts to deteriorate, we know about it. I studied the screens, trying to make sense of the constantly shifting data. One monitor showed a map of the world with coloured dots marking locations where anomalous events had occurred in the past 24 hours. Another displayed what looked like seismic data, but with patterns that seemed too regular to be natural earthquakes. What's the current status? Eleanor's expression grew grave. Declining. The binding has been weakening steadily for the past 15 years, accelerating in the past 5. We estimate maybe 2 to 3 years before complete failure becomes inevitable. What happens then? Unknown. The historical records from previous binding failures are incomplete. The monks who witnessed them were usually dead within months, but we can make educated guesses based on pattern analysis. She pulled up another screen, this one showing a timeline of major global events overlaid with containment stability measurements. The correlation was undeniable. Every period of significant chaos in human history corresponded with dramatic drops in whatever they were measuring. Complete binding failure would likely trigger cascading system collapses, Eleanor continued. Political institutions, economic markets, social structures, all the complex relationships that hold civilization together become vulnerable when certain types of influence are unchecked. How bad are we talking? Best case scenario? A severe global recession coupled with widespread political instability, multiple government collapses, market crashes, social unrest spreading faster than any rational analysis would predict. And worst case? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying the data streams that painted an increasingly grim picture of whatever they were monitoring. Worst case is the end of human civilization as we know it, not through nuclear war or climate change or any of the threats people talk about in public, through something much more fundamental, the breakdown of the psychological and spiritual structures that allow complex societies to exist. She pulled up historical records from previous binding failures, translated accounts from Tibetan monasteries that had witnessed similar events centuries earlier. The entity doesn't destroy through physical force, she explained. It works through consciousness, through the collective human capacity for cooperation and rational thought. When the binding fails completely, people lose the ability to trust institutions, to believe in shared values, to work together toward common goals. Everything falls apart from within. I stared at the monitors, watching real-time measurements of something that supposedly determined the fate of human civilization. The graphs showed steady decline across multiple indicators, punctuated by sudden spikes that corresponded to major news events I recognized from recent headlines. This is why you needed an outside journalist, I realized. The inner circle is dying off, and you need someone to document the whole system before it's too late. Partly. But there's another reason. Eleanor turned to face me directly. We think the traditional approach might be fundamentally flawed. What do you mean? The grove, the annual ceremonies, the networking among powerful elites. It all assumes that influence and authority are the same thing they were 50 years ago. But the world has changed. Real power increasingly lies with people who have no connection to traditional institutions. She pulled up another screen, this one showing social media analytics and internet traffic patterns. Modern influence is distributed, digital, and often anonymous. A teenager with a viral video can shape public opinion more effectively than a senator. Cryptocurrency traders can destabilize national currencies. Hackers can cripple infrastructure. The Grove model assumes that controlling government and corporate leaders gives you control over social stability. But it doesn't anymore. Exactly. Which means our containment strategy might be obsolete just when we need it most. Eleanor stood up, pacing between the monitors. We need new approaches, new methods, new people involved in the binding process. But we also need someone on the outside who can document everything we've learned, preserve the institutional knowledge in case our transition efforts fail. You want me to write the ultimate conspiracy theory article. I want you to write the truth. All of it. The complete history of Project Owl, the scientific evidence for non-physical phenomena affecting global stability, the methods we've developed for managing existential threats that most people don't believe exist. She led me to another section of the archive, this one containing dozens of film reels stored in climate-controlled cases. But first, you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. The Nazi expedition that started all this documented their activities extensively. They filmed everything, convinced they were making history. Eleanor selected one of the reels and loaded it into a vintage projector that looked like it belonged in a museum. The screen flickered to life, showing black and white footage of men in SS uniforms working in what appeared to be a Tibetan monastery. Tibet, 1943, Eleanor narrated as the images played. The Ahnenerbe expedition, led by Heinrich Himmler's personal occult research division. They found what they were looking for, but they had no idea what they were actually dealing with. The film showed German archaeologists carefully removing artifacts from hidden chambers, documenting everything with scientific precision. But as they worked, the footage began to show anomalies, shadows that moved independently of their sources, equipment malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. And in the faces of the expedition members, a growing sense of unease that became terror as the film progressed. "Watch what happens when they break the original seal," Eleanor said. On screen, the Germans used explosives to breach a stone chamber that had clearly been sealed for centuries. The moment the barrier cracked, the camera recorded something that made my skin crawl, a sound like wind rushing through tunnels, but with an intelligence behind it that felt actively malevolent. The expedition members began arguing, then fighting, then turning on each other with a violence that seemed to come from nowhere. Within hours of breaking the seal, half the team was dead, and the survivors were fleeing through the mountains carrying only the most portable artifacts. "They thought they'd found weapons," Eleanor explained as the reel ended. What they actually found was something that used them as weapons against each other. The surviving members of the expedition spent the rest of the war trying to develop countermeasures, but it was too late. The damage was already spreading. She loaded another reel, this one showing American soldiers in 1945 investigating what remained of German occult research facilities. General Patton's intelligence units found the Nazi research archives during the final push into Germany. Most of it was dismissed as mystical nonsense, but a few people recognized the potential strategic implications. The second film showed American scientists examining the artifacts that would eventually end up at Bohemian Grove, testing them with instruments that clearly couldn't measure what they were really dealing with. But the effects were undeniable. Personnel exposed to the artifacts began exhibiting erratic behavior, making increasingly irrational decisions, turning against colleagues and superiors without apparent cause. Project Owl was established to contain and study the artifacts while developing countermeasures, Eleanor continued. The Grove became the testing ground for large-scale containment techniques. And it worked. For almost 80 years, yes, but the binding requires constant maintenance, and each generation faces new challenges. She showed me more reels, documenting decades of research and development, scientists working to understand forces that couldn't be quantified, politicians unknowingly participating in rituals designed to maintain global stability, business leaders whose networking activities served purposes they never suspected. The most recent footage showed the Grove ceremonies I'd witnessed, but from multiple camera angles that revealed details invisible to casual observers. During the official cremation of care, sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked energy fluctuations that spiked dramatically during specific moments of the ritual. The hidden ceremony showed even more dramatic readings, with measurements that peaked exactly when the chanting reached its climax. The science isn't complete, Eleanor admitted. We're still working with phenomena that exist at the intersection of consciousness and physics, in areas where traditional materialist approaches break down. But the effects are measurable, reproducible, and absolutely critical for global stability. Why hasn't any of this been published? Because publication would destroy the effectiveness of the countermeasures. The binding works partly because the participants believe in what they're doing, even if they don't understand the underlying mechanisms. Widespread skepticism and debunking would undermine the psychological foundations that make the ritual effective. She gestured toward the monitors showing real-time containment data. But we're reaching a point where secrecy might be more dangerous than exposure. The traditional power structures that maintain the Grove system are fragmenting. New forms of influence are emerging faster than we can adapt, and the entity itself seems to be evolving, finding new ways to exploit modern communication systems and social networks. What are you asking me to do? Eleanor stopped the projector and faced me directly. Document everything. Learn how the system works, understand what's at stake, and prepare a complete record that can preserve this knowledge for future generations. Then help us figure out how to adapt these techniques for a world where power and influence operate according to completely different rules. And if I refuse? Then you'll have an interesting story about rich men performing rituals in the woods. You'll publish it, people will read it as entertainment, and the most important secret in human history will die with us. The monitors around us continued their steady tracking of forces I was only beginning to understand. Whatever they were measuring was declining steadily, and the implications of that decline were more terrifying than any conventional threat I could imagine. How long do I have to decide? The next phase of your education starts tonight, Eleanor said. We'll show you the complete film archive, introduce you to the current research team, and give you access to the real-time monitoring systems. After that, you'll understand exactly what's at stake. She began shutting down the projection equipment, preparing to leave the archive. But I should warn you, once you've seen everything, there's no going back. The knowledge becomes a responsibility, and that responsibility will follow you for the rest of your life. As we climbed back toward the surface, I tried to process what I'd learned. Either I'd stumbled into the most elaborate hoax in human history, or I was being invited to document something that made every conspiracy theory seem quaint by comparison. The shed above us looked innocent enough in the afternoon sunlight, just another maintenance building in a forest full of them. But beneath our feet lay evidence of forces that supposedly shaped the course of human civilization, monitored by people who carried the weight of secrets too dangerous for public consumption. Tomorrow night, I'd see the rest of the archive. Tomorrow night, I'd learn whether Project Owl represented humanity's greatest triumph or its most necessary deception. Either way, my life as I knew it was ending. The only question was what would replace it. Eleanor met me again at sunset, appearing beside my cabin as the dinner bell rang across the grove. Around us, members were gathering for the evening's entertainment, some kind of historical presentation about Grove traditions that would give us perfect cover for our real activities. "Tonight you see everything," she said simply. "The complete archive going back to the beginning. Fair warning, some of it isn't easy to watch." We took a different route to the underground facility, following maintenance paths that avoided the main camp areas. Eleanor moved with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey countless times, but I noticed she kept checking her watch with increasing frequency. "Are we on a schedule?" "The containment readings have been fluctuating all day," she explained. "Nothing critical yet, but we want to complete your education before the situation becomes complicated." The archive felt different at night. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows between the shelving units, and the climate control system seemed louder in the darkness above. Eleanor led me to a section I hadn't seen before, where dozens of film canisters were stored in temperature-controlled cases. "Chronological order," she said, pulling out the first reel. "Tibet, 1943. This is where it all started." The footage was better preserved than I'd expected, considering its age. German expedition members documented their activities with scientific precision, filming everything from arrival at the monastery to the careful cataloguing of artifacts they found in hidden chambers. But what struck me most was the change in the expedition members themselves as the film progressed. They started as confident researchers, convinced they were recovering important historical artifacts for the Reich. By the end, they were hollow-eyed and paranoid, jumping at shadows and arguing with increasing violence over trivial decisions. "Watch the progression," Eleanor advised as she loaded the second reel. "The deterioration follows a predictable pattern." She was right. The expedition leader, who appeared calm and competent in early footage, gradually became erratic and suspicious. He began seeing conspiracies among his own team members, making accusations that had no basis in reality. Other team members developed obsessive behaviours, repetitive actions that served no logical purpose, but which they couldn't seem to stop. The entity doesn't possess people in any dramatic sense, Eleanor explained. It influences them, amplifies existing psychological weaknesses, makes rational cooperation increasingly difficult. The later reels showed the aftermath. German scientists attempting to study the recovered artefacts, unaware that exposure to them was affecting their judgment and behaviour. Research that started as methodical investigation devolved into fractured efforts as team members became unable to work together effectively. By 1944, the Nazi research program was in complete disarray, Eleanor said, loading footage from American intelligence units, not because they lacked resources or expertise, but because the people involved had lost the capacity for organised, rational effort. The American footage was even more disturbing. Soldiers who'd participated in securing the German research facilities began exhibiting similar symptoms within weeks: paranoia, aggression, an inability to follow orders or work as a team. The artefacts were quickly transferred to secure facilities, but the damage was already spreading through the military units involved. This is when President Roosevelt authorised Project Owl, Eleanor said, showing me classified documents I definitely shouldn't have been seeing. The decision was made to contain the artefacts rather than study them, at least until we understood what we were dealing with. The next series of reels documented the early years of the Grove's involvement. Prominent businessmen and politicians who thought they were participating in elaborate team-building exercises, unaware that their activities were being carefully monitored for their effects on containment stability. The beautiful irony, Eleanor noted, is that the most effective participants were people who took the ritual seriously, without believing in their literal truth. They invested genuine emotional energy in symbolic activities, creating the psychological resonance necessary for containment without the skepticism that would undermine it. I watched decades of Grove ceremonies, seeing the evolution from crude early attempts to the sophisticated rituals I'd witnessed. The filmmakers documented everything from multiple angles, tracking correlations between participant behaviour and mysterious readings on monitoring equipment. The breakthrough came in 1963, Eleanor said, loading a reel marked Project Mindbridge Consciousness Research Initiative. We finally began to understand the relationship between collective human consciousness and what we were trying to contain. This footage showed scientists working with equipment that looked decades ahead of anything I'd seen in public research facilities. They were mapping what they called psychic resonance fields, measuring the effects of focused group attention on phenomena that traditional science insisted didn't exist. Consciousness isn't passive, Eleanor explained as the footage showed researchers monitoring brainwave patterns during Grove ceremonies. Under specific conditions, focused human attention can influence physical processes through mechanisms we still don't fully understand. The evidence was compelling. During successful binding rituals, monitoring equipment showed dramatic changes in local electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and other effects that defied conventional explanation. The more focused and emotionally invested the participants, the stronger the measured effects. But the most important discovery was that the entity itself is conscious, Eleanor continued, loading a reel from the 1970s. Not conscious like a human or animal, but aware in ways that allow it to adapt and respond to our containment efforts. This footage was harder to watch. It showed experiments where researchers deliberately weakened containment protocols to study the entity's responses. The results were horrifying. Within hours, people exposed to the weakened binding began turning on each other with a savagery that had no rational explanation. We learned that it doesn't just influence behaviour randomly, Eleanor said. It targets the specific psychological and social bonds that hold groups together. It makes people distrust authority, question shared values, abandon cooperation in favour of individual survival. The final series of reels brought the documentation up to the present day. Recent Grove ceremonies filmed with modern digital equipment, showing measurements that painted an increasingly dire picture. The binding was weakening despite their best efforts, and the entity's influence was spreading through channels they were still struggling to understand. Internet culture, social media, digital communication, they've created new vectors for the kind of psychological influence the entity specialises in, Eleanor explained. People are more isolated, more suspicious, more prone to conspiracy thinking than ever before. The very technologies that connect us globally are making us more vulnerable to forces that exploit human psychological weaknesses. She showed me correlation analyses that were truly frightening. Every major spike in online harassment, political extremism, and social division corresponded with measured fluctuations in containment stability. The entity wasn't just confined to the physical artifacts anymore. It was spreading through digital networks, using human communication systems to amplify its influence. This is why traditional approaches aren't working, Eleanor said. The Grove model assumes that controlling physical locations and influential people gives you control over social stability. But in a networked world, influence operates according to completely different rules. The most recent footage showed research teams working on new approaches, attempts to create digital containment protocols, online rituals that could engage globally distributed participants, technological methods for monitoring and countering the entity's influence through internet channels. The preliminary results are promising, Eleanor admitted, but we're running out of time. The traditional binding is failing faster than we can develop alternatives. She turned off the projection equipment and faced me directly. That's the complete record. 80 years of research containment and gradual understanding of something that exists at the intersection of consciousness and physics. Now, you understand what we're really dealing with. I sat in silence for several minutes trying to process what I'd seen. The footage was too detailed, too consistent, too well documented to be an elaborate hoax. But accepting it as real meant accepting that everything I thought I knew about how the world worked was fundamentally incomplete. What do you need from me? Help us bridge the gap between old knowledge and new realities, Eleanor said. Document everything we've learned, but also help us figure out how to adapt these techniques for a world where influence operates through social media and digital networks rather than exclusive clubs and private meetings. I'm a journalist, not a researcher. You're someone who understands how information spreads in the modern world, how narratives form and evolve, how public opinion gets shaped by forces most people never notice. Those are exactly the skills we need. She gestured toward the monitors showing real-time containment data. The entity is learning to use our own communication systems against us. We need people who understand those systems well enough to develop countermeasures. And if we fail, Eleanor's expression grew grave. Then within the next few years, human civilization enters a period of chaos and collapse, unlike anything in recorded history. Not through war or natural disaster, but through the breakdown of the psychological foundations that make complex societies possible. The weight of what she was telling me settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. If they were right, I wasn't just being offered the story of a lifetime, I was being recruited to help prevent the end of the world as we knew it. When do we start? Tomorrow, Eleanor said. But first, you need to see what happens when containment fails. We have one more reel to show you. Footage from 1962, when a test of weakened binding protocols got out of hand. She loaded the final reel, and I watched something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Research subjects exposed to deliberately weakened containment turned on each other with a ferocity that looked less like human behaviour than like animals driven mad by disease. Within hours, rational people became incapable of basic cooperation, seeing enemies everywhere, responding to imagined threats with real violence. Multiply that by global population, Eleanor said quietly, and you begin to understand what we're trying to prevent. As we climbed back toward the surface, I realised there was no going back. Whether Project Owl represented the most important secret in human history, or the most elaborate delusion ever created, I was now part of it. The knowledge had become a responsibility, and that responsibility would shape everything I did for the rest of my life. Above us, the Grove continued its normal activities. Powerful people, networking and bonding, unaware that their casual retreats served a purpose that might determine the survival of human civilization. Tomorrow I'd begin learning how to help them succeed. I woke before dawn to the sound of helicopters, not the distant drone of aircraft passing over, but the heavy thrum of rotors directly overhead, circling the Grove in patterns that suggested search rather than transport. Eleanor appeared at my cabin door before I'd finished dressing. her usual composed demeanour replaced by urgent tension. "We have a problem," she said simply. "Someone's been monitoring our activities." She led me quickly through the forest, avoiding the main paths and staying under tree cover that would hide us from aerial observation. "The helicopters were government aircraft," she explained, "but not ones under Project Owl's control. Different agencies have different levels of clearance," she said as we moved. "Some know about our activities, some know only pieces, and some know nothing but suspect something significant is happening here." "Which category do the helicopters represent?" "The dangerous one. People who know enough to be suspicious but not enough to understand the consequences of interference." We reached the concealed entrance to the archive facility, but Eleanor didn't lead me inside. Instead, she continued deeper into the forest, towards sections of the grove I'd never seen. "The underground facility is compromised," she explained. "Motion sensors, thermal imaging, electromagnetic monitoring. Anyone with the right equipment can detect activity below ground. We need to show you the backup systems." After 20 minutes of hiking through increasingly dense forest, we reached what appeared to be a natural clearing dominated by a single massive redwood. Eleanor approached the tree and pressed her hand against a section of bark that looked identical to every other section. A hidden panel slid aside, revealing modern electronic equipment built directly into the living wood. "Emergency monitoring station," she said, activating screens that showed the same real-time data I'd seen in the underground archive. "If the main facility's compromised, we can still track containment stability from here." The readings were worse than anything I'd seen before. Multiple indicators showed rapid deterioration, with fluctuations that spiked dramatically every time the helicopters passed overhead. "Electromagnetic interference," Eleanor explained. "The aircraft are disrupting the resonance fields that maintain the binding. They don't know what they're doing, but the effect is cumulative." As if summoned by her words, one of the helicopters passed directly overhead, and the monitoring equipment registered a spike that made Eleanor curse under her breath. "We need to evacuate the sensitive materials," she said, beginning to shut down the equipment. "The original artifacts, the most critical research data, anything that can't be replaced." "Where?" "Secondary sites." We learned decades ago never to keep everything in one location. She finished securing the monitoring station and led me back toward the main camp. "But first, we need to get you away from here. If this goes wrong, you're the only person outside the project who knows the complete truth." We were halfway back to my cabin when the shooting started. Not gunfire, something else. The sharp crack of what sounded like electrical discharges. Through the trees, I could see flashes of light that had nothing to do with the helicopters overhead. "What is that?" Eleanor grabbed my arm, pulling me behind the massive trunk of an ancient redwood. "Containment failure. The electromagnetic interference pushed the binding past critical thresholds." The flashes were coming from the direction of the sacred grove, where the official ceremonies took place. But these weren't artificial lights. They looked like lightning, but moving in patterns that defied any natural explanation. "The entity is breaking through," Eleanor said, checking her watch with obvious anxiety. "Localized manifestation, probably limited to the immediate area, but we need to implement emergency protocols immediately." "What kind of emergency protocols?" Before she could answer, a man appeared through the trees, one of the Grove members I'd seen at the dining hall, but changed in ways that made my skin crawl. His face was twisted with rage that seemed to come from nowhere, and he was carrying what appeared to be a broken tree branch like a weapon. "You?" he said, focusing on Eleanor with hatred that was obviously irrational. You're the one who's been lying to us." Eleanor stepped back, keeping the tree trunk between herself and the approaching man. "George, you need to get back to your cabin. You're not thinking clearly." "Thinking perfectly clearly for the first time in years," George replied, raising the makeshift weapon. "Seeing through all the lies, all the manipulation. You people think you can control us, think you can use us for your games." He swung the branch at Eleanor's head with murderous intent. She dodged, but barely, and I realised with growing horror that we were seeing the entity's influence in real time. George wasn't just angry. He was completely detached from normal human empathy and reason. "This is what happens when containment fails," Eleanor said quietly, pulling me deeper into the forest. People lose the capacity for rational cooperation. They see enemies everywhere, respond to imagined threats with real violence. Behind us, George was joined by others, Grove members who transformed from networking politicians and businessmen into something that barely resembled human beings. They moved with pack mentality, communicating through gestures and sounds that suggested intelligence but not consciousness as I understood it. How do we stop it? Emergency binding ritual, Eleanor said, leading me toward another concealed facility. But it requires specific people in specific locations, and we're running out of time. The facility she brought me to was smaller than the main archive, but clearly designed for crisis situations. Emergency supplies, backup communication equipment, and most importantly, a collection of artefacts identical to the ones I'd seen in the underground chamber. Portable containment kit, Eleanor explained, gathering materials with practiced efficiency. The ritual can be performed anywhere, but it's less stable than the permanent installation. She handed me a metal disc covered with the same spiralling symbols I'd seen before, but this one felt warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate with energy I couldn't identify. Hold this and think calming thoughts, she instructed. Visualize peace, cooperation, people working together toward common goals. The binding responds to consciousness, but it requires focused intention from multiple participants. I don't know how to do this. You don't need training, you need belief. The entity feeds on conflict and suspicion. The binding requires the opposite. Trust, cooperation, shared purpose. As she spoke, the sounds from outside grew worse. More Grove members had joined the pack hunting us, but their behaviour was becoming less and less human. They were making sounds that reminded me of wolves or wild dogs, communicating through methods that bypassed language entirely. They're not possessed, Eleanor explained, setting up equipment that looked like a cross between a radio and a meditation altar. They're influenced. The entity amplifies existing psychological weaknesses, selfishness, paranoia, aggression, until rational cooperation becomes impossible. How long does it last? Without intervention? Permanent. The changes become self-reinforcing, creating a cycle of escalating conflict that spreads to anyone exposed to the affected individuals. She activated the emergency equipment, and I felt the disc in my hands grow warmer. Around us, the air seemed to thicken, taking on the quality of electrical charge that precedes thunderstorms. Now, Eleanor said, focus on everything that makes human civilization possible. Trust between strangers, cooperation across differences, the willingness to sacrifice individual advantage for collective benefit. I tried to do what she asked, but the sounds outside made concentration nearly impossible. The hunting pack had found our location and was circling the facility, testing for weak points with animal cunning. It's not working, I said. It needs more participants, Eleanor admitted. The emergency protocol requires at least 7 people working in coordination. I was hoping we could manage with 2, but the interference is too strong. As if responding to her words, the attackers began trying to break down the door, but their methods were wrong somehow. They were using tactics that might work against prey animals, but not against humans who understood tools and leverage. Their intelligence is being affected, Eleanor observed. They're losing abstract reasoning, reverting to more primitive cognitive patterns. Is that good or bad for us? Both. They can't plan sophisticated attacks, but they also can't be reasoned with or distracted. The door was beginning to buckle under coordinated assault. Within minutes they'd break through, and I had no illusions about what would happen then. The people outside might once have been politicians and businessmen, but they'd become something that saw us as threats to be eliminated. Eleanor made a decision that probably saved our lives. Run, she said, gathering the most essential artifacts into a backpack. There's a service road 2 miles north of here. Follow it east until you reach Highway 101, then go south to San Francisco. What about you? I'll try to implement the emergency protocol with whatever Grove members are still unaffected, but you need to get this information to the outside world. She handed me a small device that looked like an ordinary cell phone but felt heavier than it should. Encrypted satellite communicator, she explained. Speed dial 1 connects you to our backup facility in Colorado. Tell them what happened here and give them your location. They'll arrange extraction and debriefing. The door gave way just as we climbed out through a concealed rear exit. I heard Eleanor shouting something that sounded like Latin, saw flashes of light that suggested she was attempting some kind of emergency ritual, but I was already running through the forest as fast as the terrain would allow. Behind me, the sounds of conflict grew worse, not just the pack that had been hunting us, but what sounded like warfare spreading throughout the grove. The entity's influence was expanding, affecting more and more people, creating a feedback loop of violence that would keep escalating until someone found a way to stop it. I ran for over an hour, following game trails and maintenance paths that led generally north. Twice I heard helicopters overhead, but I couldn't tell if they were still part of the problem or part of some attempted solution. The encrypted communicator remained silent. Either the backup facility was out of range, or something had happened to it as well. The service road, when I finally found it, was blocked by abandoned vehicles. Grove security guards had apparently fled their posts, leaving gates open and equipment scattered. Whatever had happened here was bigger than just the immediate area around the sacred grove. I followed the road east on foot, staying off the asphalt to avoid being visible from the air. The communicator finally picked up a signal as I reached higher ground, but when I activated speed dial 1, the response wasn't what I had expected. "Project Owl emergency line," a voice said. "State your clearance level and location." "I don't have a clearance level," I said. "Eleanor Hartwell gave me this device. There's been a containment failure at Bohemian Grove." A pause, then. "Are you the journalist?" "Yes." "We've been expecting your call. What's your current location?" I described my position as best I could, and the voice gave me coordinates for a pickup point 5 miles south of my position. "Emergency extraction team is en route," the voice said. "ETA 40 minutes. Stay hidden until you see a black helicopter with owl markings." "What happened to Eleanor?" Another pause, longer this time. "Unknown. We lost contact with all Grove personnel 3 hours ago. You may be the only survivor with first-hand knowledge of the incident." The call ended, leaving me alone on a forest road with the weight of impossible knowledge. If Eleanor was right, I'd just witnessed the beginning of something that could destroy human civilization. If she was wrong, I'd been recruited into the most elaborate delusion in history. Either way, there was no going back. The story I'd come to investigate had become my life, and that life would never be the same. The helicopter that picked me up wasn't military, but it wasn't civilian either. Black, unmarked, with sound dampening that made it whisper rather than roar. The pilot didn't speak during the 40-minute flight south, and the windows were tinted too dark to see our destination until we landed. The facility looked like a corporate retreat centre, modern architecture nestled in rolling hills, solar panels and native landscaping that suggested environmental consciousness rather than government secrecy. Only the subtle security measures revealed its true nature. Sensors disguised as decorative elements, barriers that looked like artistic features, multiple escape routes hidden as walking paths. Eleanor was waiting for me in the lobby. She looked exhausted but uninjured, wearing clean clothes that suggested she'd arrived well before me. Relief flooded through me at seeing her alive, followed immediately by suspicion about how she'd gotten here so quickly. "You made it," she said, embracing me with what felt like genuine emotion. "I wasn't sure you would." "How are you here?" "I thought you were trapped at the Grove." "Emergency protocols," she explained, leading me toward a conference room. "The moment containment failed, automated systems began evacuating key personnel and sensitive materials. I was out within minutes of your escape." The conference room contained a dozen people I'd never seen before, all of them studying multiple screens showing data feeds from Bohemian Grove. The footage was disturbing. Grove members moving in coordinated packs, exhibiting behaviour that looked less human with each passing hour. "Situation report," said a woman who appeared to be in charge, younger than Eleanor, with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Complete local containment failure," Eleanor replied. "The electromagnetic interference from unauthorized surveillance pushed binding stability past critical thresholds. The entity achieved localized manifestation and began directly influencing exposed personnel. Casualties? Unknown. Approximately 200 Grove members were on site when the failure occurred. Current status of affected individuals is unclear, but behavioral modification appears to be progressing according to predicted patterns. I watched the screens showing real-time footage from the grove, trying to process what I was seeing. The people in the images moved with animal coordination, but their actions showed planning and intelligence that suggested they weren't completely reduced to primitive instincts. "They're organising," I observed. "Exactly," said the woman in charge. "The entity doesn't just cause chaos, it creates new forms of order based on conflict and dominance rather than cooperation and trust. Left unchecked, the affected population will form a functional society, but one dedicated to spreading their condition to others." "How?" Eleanor pulled up additional screens showing modelling predictions. "Physical contact isn't required. Extended exposure to affected individuals gradually influences behaviour in others. The process is slower than direct manifestation, but it's cumulative and irreversible without intervention." "What kind of intervention?" "That's what we need to decide," the woman in charge said. "We have 3 options, none of them good." She activated a presentation that laid out scenarios with clinical precision. Option 1, military containment. Seal off the affected area, prevent anyone from leaving, wait for the situation to stabilise. The affected population would eventually die off, but we'd lose any chance of understanding how the entity adapted to modern conditions. Option 2, aggressive binding ritual. Deploy our full capabilities to re-establish containment, potentially reversing the effects on affected individuals. High probability of success, but it would require resources that might be needed for future emergencies. Option 3, strategic documentation. Allow the situation to develop while recording everything, learning how the entity operates in uncontrolled conditions. Massive risk of spread, but invaluable data for developing long-term countermeasures. The weight of what they were asking settled on me like a physical presence. These weren't abstract policy decisions. They were choices about the lives of people I'd shared meals with, conversations with, casual moments of human connection that now seemed impossibly precious. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "That depends on you," Eleanor said. "You're the only person who witnessed the complete sequence of events, the only outsider who understands what's really at stake. Your perspective could determine which approach we take." I studied the screens showing real-time surveillance of the grove. The affected members were building something, crude structures that served purposes I couldn't identify, but which suggested they retained enough intelligence to plan and execute complex projects. They're not just reverting to primitive behaviour, I realised. They're creating something new. "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "The entity doesn't destroy civilization. It transforms it into something that serves its purposes rather than human ones." "And if this spreads beyond the grove?" "Modelling suggests a tipping point around 10,000 affected individuals," the woman in charge said. "Beyond that, containment becomes impossible. The entity achieves critical mass and begins reshaping human civilization according to its own principles." I stared at the screens, watching people who'd once controlled vast resources and wielded enormous influence reduced to something that resembled humanity, but fundamentally wasn't. The choice they were asking me to make would determine not just the fate of those individuals, but potentially the future of human civilization itself. "How long do we have to decide?" "Hours," Eleanor said grimly. "The affected population is already attempting to breach the grove's perimeter. Once they reach populated areas, the window for containment closes permanently." As if summoned by her words, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. On the screens, we watched Grove members systematically dismantling the barriers that had kept them isolated from the outside world. They moved with coordinated purpose, using tools and techniques that suggested retained intelligence despite their transformed state. "They're adapting faster than our models predicted," the woman in charge observed. "The entity is learning from direct interaction with modern infrastructure." I made my decision. "Option 2, I said. "Full binding ritual. Try to save them." Eleanor nodded grimly. "It'll require everything we have. If we fail, there won't be resources left for future containment efforts. And if we do nothing, there won't be a future to contain." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of coordinated activity. Teams deployed to locations around the grove, carrying artifacts and equipment I was only beginning to understand. The binding ritual required precise positioning, perfect timing, and absolute faith in principles that defied everything I'd learned about how the world worked. But it worked. I watched on screens as the coordinated behaviour of the affected Grove members gradually became confused, then chaotic, then slowly returned to something recognisably human. The transformation took hours, but by dawn, rescue teams were extracting survivors who remembered nothing of their transformed state, but everything of their normal lives. The official story, when it emerged, blamed a gas leak for temporary behavioural effects among Grove attendees. A few conspiracy theorists suggested government mind control experiments, but without hard evidence, their theories joined the usual background noise of speculation about elite gatherings. 6 months later, I sit in my apartment staring at a hard drive containing the complete documentation of Project Owl. Video footage, research data, historical records, and testimony from dozens of participants spanning 8 decades of secret work to maintain global stability. The binding held. The Grove members recovered completely, with no memory of their transformation. The immediate crisis passed, and the world continued its normal pattern of manageable chaos and incremental progress. But the monitoring data tells a different story. The entity learned from its brief manifestation. Each subsequent containment requires more resources, more participants, more sophisticated countermeasures. The traditional approaches that worked for decades are becoming less effective with each passing year. Eleanor calls weekly with updates from facilities I'm not supposed to know exist. Teams working on digital containment protocols, researchers developing new methods for managing consciousness-based phenomena, analysts tracking the entity's adaptation to modern communication networks. They're making progress, but the race is getting closer. My phone buzzes with news alerts. Political assassinations in 3 countries, simultaneous market crashes that defy economic analysis, social unrest spreading through digital networks faster than anyone can track. Each event correlates with fluctuations in containment stability, signs that the old binding is weakening despite our best efforts. I have a choice to make. The hard drive contains everything needed to preserve Project Owl's institutional knowledge. Published as fiction, it would ensure the information survives, even if the current organisation fails. Presented as investigative journalism, it might mobilise resources for developing new containment methods. But publication might also undermine the psychological foundations that make the binding effective. Widespread skepticism could destroy the very mechanisms that have protected human civilization for 80 years. My cursor hovers over the upload button for a secure server that would distribute the complete files to journalists worldwide. With one click, I could expose the most important secret in human history. Or I could delete everything and trust that the people carrying this burden know what they're doing. Outside my window, the city continues its normal rhythm of traffic and commerce. Millions of people living their lives unaware that the stability they take for granted depends on secrets, too dangerous for public consumption. They don't know that their capacity for trust, cooperation and rational discourse is maintained by forces that most would dismiss as impossible. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some truths are too important to share. I close the laptop without making a decision, knowing I'll face the same choice tomorrow and the day after, and every day until either the binding holds permanently or everything falls apart. The hard drive sits on my desk like a loaded weapon, containing information that could save the world or destroy it, depending on how it's used. In the forest north of San Francisco, ancient redwoods continue their patient growth, sheltering secrets that predate human civilization. Beneath their roots, monitoring equipment tracks forces that exist at the intersection of consciousness and physics, measuring phenomena that determine whether humanity remains capable of the cooperation and trust that make complex societies possible. The owl watches and waits, neither good nor evil, but something far more dangerous. A force of pure change that cares nothing for human hopes or fears. And somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, it grows stronger. Maybe they weren't hiding power. Maybe they were hiding what power keeps at bay. But how long can any cage hold something that learns from every attempt to contain it? I guess we'll find out.